geólogo de formación que ha estudiado los recursos energéticos de Canadá durante casi 4 décadas, que incluye 32 años como científico y director de investigación en el Geological Survey of Canada. Desarrolló el Inventario Nacional de Carbón para determinar la disponibilidad de límites medioambientales a los recursos de carbón canadienses y también como líder de la sección de gas no convencional en el Comité Canadiense del Gas, coordinó la publicación de la estimación más detallada hasta la fecha del potencial del gas no convencional en este país. O sea, tiene una experiencia muy, muy vasta. En la actualidad es el presidente de una empresa consultora dedicada a la investigación en energía y sostenibilidad. Y durante la década pasada ha investigado y publicado y impartido conferencias tanto en Norteamérica como internacionalmente. Citar una vez más su trabajo, porque es una referencia realmente hoy en día para el Post-Carbon Institute, que es el informe que hemos comentado, y que, como ha dicho Antonio antes, es el análisis públicamente disponible más detallado de las posibilidades de las perspectivas del gas y petróleo de lutitas en Estados Unidos. Entonces yo, bueno, ya le voy a dar paso para que comience su presentación. David, as you wish.
Okay, what I'd like to cover briefly in this talk is what I call the energy sustainability dilemma. I'd like to look at some of the possible solutions, unconventional fuels, tar sands, oil shale, and of course shale gas and tight oil, and look at some of the implications for long-term energy sustainability. So if you look at the past, this is the last 4.5 decades of consumption. You can see that consumption in the world has more than tripled, and fossil fuels make up about 87% of our consumption at present. So we're really on an exponential uphill growth in consumption. If you look at the last century and a half, this is back to 1850. This is per capita consumption over the last 160 years. So we can see basically that per capita consumption has increased by over 800%. And really that's attributable to coal, oil, and gas and uranium. So 87% again being non-renewable. Next slide. Going back to 1850 again, this is population, per capita consumption, and total energy consumption. So total consumption is obviously a product of population and per capita consumption, and it's gone up about 50 times over the last 160 years. Next slide. This is a reference case forecast out of the EIA, International Energy Outlook, a couple of years back. It hasn't changed that much. And you can see this is where we're going with fossil fuels. So population will have increased to 6.8 times 1850. Each person will be consuming more energy per capita, according to this forecast. So the world will need 70 times as much energy in 2035 as in 1850. Next slide. This is where energy was derived from back in 2011. And you can see if you add biofuels to non-hydro renewables, non-hydro renewables come out to a little over 2%. There's probably still less than 3% as of 2014. So we can see that things like wind and solar have increased exponentially, but from a very small base in terms of having any significant impact on fossil fuel consumption. Next slide. This is the cumulative consumption of fossil fuels from 1850. We've used about 3 trillion barrels of oil, gas, and coal in terms of oil equivalent. 90% of that fossil fuel has been consumed since 1938, and half of it since 1986. So we're on an uphill spiral of consumption in terms of fossil fuels. Next slide. And this is what it will look like through 2035 if that forecast comes to fruition. So by 2035, the world will have consumed 5.2 trillion barrels of oil equivalent in terms of fossil fuels. So we need 71% more energy than the human race has burned from 1850 to 2011 to meet this forecast by 2035. Next slide. The other big issue with energy consumption in the world is the inequity in per capita consumption rates around the world. So if we look at the OECD countries, we can see that they comprise less than 20% of the world's population. But on a per capita basis, they consume 4 times as much energy as the non-OECD world. Next slide. And if we look strictly at oil, we can see the same disparity. A third of the world's population consumes more than the average per capita consumption, which is around 4 barrels per person per year. The US consumes 22 barrels per year per person, and Canada consumes 25. So this is a big geopolitical issue going forward. Next slide. Government agencies aren't particularly good at forecasting things like oil consumption. This is a dozen or so forecasts out of the EIA for world oil consumption compared to what actually happened. So in general, governments tend to overestimate actual production going forward. Next slide. Another extremely important issue, and I'm sure you've talked about it, is energy return on energy investment. And we can see where this has gone from old conventional oil on the left-hand side, about 100 to 1, to things like ethanol from corn, which is barely break even, biodiesel from soybeans, things like tar sands, mineable and in situ, are very low quality sources of fossil fuels or liquids compared to Saudi Arabia back in the 50s. Next slide. This is a resource pyramid basically showing very loosely the differentiation between unconventional fuels and conventional fuels. We've been working on really the high quality fossil fuels at the top of this pyramid. As we go deeper into the pyramid, the resources generally become much more abundant, but they're much more dispersed and they have a much lower energy return on investment. So somewhere fairly close, maybe a third of the way up this pyramid, there's a dotted line where one hits break even energy return on investment. So everything below that line is really not a resource. It's an energy sink. Next slide. Groups like the IEA come out with charts like this, basically purporting, in this particular case, if you look at conversions from gas to liquids, coal to liquids, biofuels, and so forth, they're suggesting 9 trillion barrels of accessible liquids in the world at prices of below $140 a barrel. And this is largely fiction in my mind. Next slide. We can look at things like the tar sands. There's about 150 billion barrels of allegedly recoverable tar sands. About 20% of that is recoverable by surface methods at an energy return on investment of about 5 or 6 to 1. 80% is recoverable only by in situ methods, basically heating up the rock to melt the bitumen out of it. And that's very energy intensive. It's about 2 or 3 to 1. Next slide. Any of these deposits also has sweet spots. This is one of the main tar sands deposits. And you can see, some of the best, thickest bitumen that's closest to the surface is in that dotted boundary, which is actually the part of the resource that might be recoverable by surface mining. Next slide. This is a series of forecasts of growth in production from the tar sands. And you can see again that most of them have been overly optimistic. They've always overestimated tar sands growth in the future. Tar sands will be important, but it's very difficult and it's very capital intensive to scale tar sands production. Next slide. If we look at what's happened just in the last few months, there's been several cancellations of tar sands projects. Statoil just canceled a large in situ operation last month. Total canceled the Jocelyn mine back in the spring. So that's some fairly large projects off the table. Next slide. If we look at things like oil shale, this is the oil shales in Utah, Colorado, and Wyoming in the U.S. Purportedly 4.2 trillion barrels in situ. Again, there's been some big players that have put a lot of money into it over the years, and nobody has really scaled it up to significant production. And some big players have recently walked away. Next slide. This is the history of oil shale production in the world up until 2000. And you can see peak oil shale was back in about 1980 at 0.02% of world consumption of liquids. So again, the question is, can you scale it? Will it work at scale? And it's also a very low energy return on energy investment. Next slide. This is the projection of biofuel production in the U.S., mostly ethanol, some biodiesel from soybean, and the elusive celluloid isn't really projected to be of much contribution up until 2035, at least. Next slide. A lot of talk about methane hydrates. Japan has done a lot of work on hydrates offshore. Again, a huge alleged resource, but there's a resource quality pyramid associated with it. And the parts of the deposits that may work are most likely onshore and associated with conventional gas pools. So you can change the pressure temperature equilibrium and dissociate the hydrates into a conventional gas pool and produce them. But again, really questionable if this is going to be scalable. Next slide. And this is the distribution of that roughly 43 trillion cubic feet of 43,000 trillion cubic feet of methane hydrates around the world. There's a lot of it, but the question is, can it be produced? So far, methane hydrates have been more of a hazard for deep water drilling than a source of energy. Next slide. There's other things like coal bed methane, which was at one point purported to be a solution for the world's gas requirements. Again, it's significant production. It's a few percent of U.S. production, but it really hasn't proven to be scalable. Underground gasification, yes, there's a lot of coal in the world. Most of what's actually been done is in Uzbekistan by the Russians. Again, yes, a source of, can it be scaled? The same thing with coal to liquids and gas to liquids. The forecasts have actually been reduced going forward. So again, a question of scalability. Enhanced oil recovery, CO2 injection, has been done for decades, and it does work, but it's really a cleanup operation. It's not a vast source of new energy. Next slide. Which brings us to the so-called shale revolution. I've been doing a lot of work on this recently, and we hope to publish 2 reports on tight oil and shale gas at the end of October. The base view the latest status of U.S. shale. I'll show you a few things from that this morning or this afternoon. Next slide. So the shale revolution really began in Texas in the Barnett Shale back in the late 90s. Mitchell Energy really figured it out. Hydraulic drilling with high volume multi-stage hydraulic fracture. It's a big deal in the U.S. It's now over 42% of U.S. gas production. The technology has been applied to shale oil or tight oil, beginning in the Bakken. But now the Eagle Ford in Texas is really the largest tight oil play. It's been remarkable. It has allowed a 50% increase in U.S. oil production. And in fact, it has been the one bright light in the world in terms of increasing crude oil production. It's expensive. Nearly 35% of upstream investment in lower 48 exploration and development in 2013 was applied to the Bakken and Eagle Ford tight oil plays. Next slide. Conventional wisdom would have us believe that the U.S. is on the verge of energy independence thanks to shale. Shale gas production will continue to grow for the foreseeable future, and prices will remain low, below $6 an MCF out to 2030. I think the price in Europe of gas is about $12 right now. Shale gas can replace substantial amounts of oil for transport and coal for electricity. It certainly has been replacing some coal for electricity. The way is clear for U.S. LNG exports to monetize the shale bounty, and in fact, people are now talking about crude oil exports out of the U.S. Tight oil will allow U.S. production to exceed that of Saudi Arabia, and U.S. imports will shrink to zero. Next slide. Shale plays are very widespread. Looking at this map, one would believe that they're ubiquitous, they're everywhere. But high-quality shale plays are a relatively small proportion of the total. Next slide. This is the EIA's reference case forecast. This was their annual energy outlook 2014. And they're projecting shale gas to grow by 150% from 2011 to 2040. And that shale gas will be 53% of production by 2040. Could you go back a slide? Another one? Yes, that one. Yeah, next slide. Sure. This shows current production by play in the U.S., the Marcellus being by far and away the largest shale gas play now, approaching 14 billion cubic feet per day. The interesting thing is the top 2 plays, the Barnett and the Marcellus, produce half of the U.S. shale gas, and the top 5 produce 82%. So good quality shale plays are definitely not ubiquitous. Next slide. Shale plays follow what I call a life cycle, typically discovery followed by a leasing frenzy. Leases typically come with 3-year held by production leases, so you have to drill in order to hold on to the leases. So the discovery is followed by a drilling boom. Sweet spots are identified during that boom. They're targeted and drilled off. Gas production rises rapidly, and in some cases is maintained for cash flow, despite uneconomic full-cycle costs. So that drilling boom drove down the price of gas in the U.S. substantially, and people lost a lot of money. Sweet spots become saturated, and well quality and field production decline. That's happening as we speak in the Barnett Shale in Texas. Plays like the Haynesville become middle-aged after just 5 years. The Haynesville was the biggest shale gas play in 2012. It was unknown in 2007. And production is now down 46% as of 2014. Next slide. This is the Barnett Shale play, so this is where it already got started. The wells here are colored by initial productivity, the highest 1 month gas production from these wells. So you can see the red areas are the real sweet spots, green areas a bit less, and the black areas are likely completely uneconomic. The good parts of the plays are quite small compared to the total play extent. Next slide. This is Barnett gas production. It peaked in late 2011. It's now down about 18% below peak. There's 16,000 producing wells in the Barnett, and there's about 20,000 wells in total. So 4,000 of those wells are no longer productive. Next slide. And this is really what made it all happen. Initially, the Barnett was explored using vertical and directional wells. Modern fracking really got going in the early part of the last decade. And you can see today, more than 95% of Barnett production comes from horizontal wells. So it really is a technology play. Next slide. The Achilles heel of shale plays, whether they're tight oil or shale gas, are decline rates. The 3-year decline in the Barnett is about 76%, so production goes down very quickly. If the well pays out, it usually pays out in the first 3 or 4 years. Next slide. This is field decline. The well declines are typically hyperbolic, so steepest in the first year and gradually decreasing as time goes by. So field decline is a combination of old wells and new wells. If you didn't drill a well in the Barnett, production would fall by about 27% per year. So this is what decline looks like if you stop drilling on January 1st, 2012. So you have to keep drilling in order to maintain, let alone grow production from shale. Next slide. This is average well quality. So this is the average amount of gas produced over the first 6 months of a well's life. And this is a measure of the interaction between better technology and worse geology. And in a mature play like the Barnett, geology is winning out, so productivity is going down, even though better and better technology is being applied to drill the wells. Next slide. If we look at the distribution of production within the Barnett play, we can see the influence of the sweet spots. So this is cumulative gas production by county. And you can see that one county, Tarrant, produced 32% of all of the gas produced, but it peaked in 2012. It's now down 20% below peak. So the Tarrant County is already up to 8 wells per square mile, so it's pretty well saturated with wells. And so as you go down the list, you can see the top 2 counties, 56% of production, the top 6, 92% of production. So even within place, there's a lot of variability. Next slide. Again, basically showing you the same thing. These are type curves. So the next slide after this one. Yeah, this is a shot of what Tarrant County looks like now. So this is the sweet spot of the Barnett play. So you can see the sort of well pad footprint that you get when one of these plays is fully developed. Next slide. So what I did for all of the major plays is factor that information, well quality, what is well quality going to look like over time, in order to forecast what production will look like over time. And I did different drilling rate scenarios. So the production profile really depends on how fast you drill wells. So for example, if you quintupled the drilling rate in the Barnett, you could in fact reverse production decline and grow to a new peak, which would happen in about 2016. But then if you look what happens to that line, it really declines a lot faster than if you drilled at a slower rate. So I've done sort of a range of forecasts and then looked at the most likely forecast, which is the red line. So we're looking at close to 40,000 wells being drilled when the Barnett is fully developed. Next slide. Another play that I mentioned, the Haynesville. This is what it looks like. It basically was unknown in 2007. It peaked in January 2012, and it's now down 46% below peak. This is really the most spectacular example of shale gas decline. The Barnett in Pennsylvania, on the other hand, is going up at quite a steep rate. Next slide. A collection of decline curves from the top 5 shale plays, just to show you that the decline pattern is pretty uniform, down an average of 84% in the first 3 years. Next slide. And the same thing for field decline. The field decline in the Haynesville is the most dramatic. It's about 49% per year if you didn't drill any wells. Next slide. So just to wrap up on shale gas, this is the latest EIA production data as of about June. And you can see that 5 major plays on the bottom, if you add them all up, collectively peaked in mid-2012 and are now down 21% below peak. So the Marcellus is making up for that. The Eagle Ford produces a lot of gas. And a smattering of other shale plays in the U.S. are all in growth mode. So overall, shale gas production is still growing in the U.S. Next slide. This is sort of the grand accumulation of all of the major plays I looked at compared to the shale gas forecast out of the EIA that I showed you right at the beginning of the talk. And it looks like in the short term, the EIA is a little pessimistic on where production is going. I expect production in the short term to exceed the EIA forecast. But in the longer term, starting in about 2017, production is going to start to fall So there has to be a lot of new development, of new plays, in order to meet that reference case forecast of the EIA. Next slide. If we turn now to tight oil, there's some very bullish forecasts of what tight oil will look like in the U.S. This is one by Ed Morse out of Citigroup, suggesting tight oil will rise to a plateau of close to 4 million barrels per day, and optimistically as much as 5 million barrels per day by 2022. Next slide. This is a forecast that was just put out by Wood Mackenzie. They're even more bullish than Citigroup, suggesting sort of in their average case 6 million barrels per day by 2030, and in their enhanced oil recovery case up to 8 million barrels per day. Next slide. The EIA is much more conservative than Citigroup or Woodmac. They're suggesting that tight oil will be roughly half of U.S. domestic supply. But rolling that out to 2040, in 2040, only 40% of U.S. liquid supply will come from crude oil production, domestic crude oil production. So imports will still be a big part of life in 2040 in this forecast, which is their 2014 reference case. Next slide. If we look at production by play, we see that happening as with shale gas. The top two plays, the Bakken and the Eagle Ford, are 62% of total tight oil production. The top 5 plays are 84%. So again, they're not ubiquitous. Good tight oil plays are not widespread. They're not that common. Next slide. If we look at an example, this is the Bakken field in North Dakota and Montana. Again, the wells are colored by initial productivity, the highest 1 month production. You can see the same pattern, the red wells in the center and on the eastern side of the field. That's the sweet spot. That's where a lot of the drilling activity is taking place today. There's about 8,500 producing wells in the Bakken at present. Next slide. Production of the oil component is now about 1 million barrels per day in the Bakken. It's growing spectacularly. If you look at the gas produced on a barrels of oil equivalent basis, it's almost up to 1.2 million barrels per day. Next slide. Same thing that we saw with shale gas, spectacular well declines. The Bakken averages 85% in the first 3 years. Next slide. And the field decline for the Bakken, which is about 45%. So if you didn't drill a well, production would fall by 45% in the first year. You need to drill a little over 1,400 wells per year at $8 billion each in order to keep Bakken production flat. They're drilling about 2,000 right now, so production is still going up. Next slide. Well quality in the Bakken is essentially flat, so that means that we're approaching the limits of better technology to increase the quality of the wells, and that's a function of geology, as more and more wells have to be drilled outside of the sweet spots. So average well productivity will fall, which means that you need even more wells to offset the field decline. Next slide. And this is the horizontal well trace pattern in the sweet spot in Montreal County. Each one of those laterals is typically about 10,000 feet long. So these are pretty spectacular technological achievements. Next slide. Production by county. The Bakken has retrieved a little over 1 billion barrels of oil since it got started. Half of that oil comes from 2 counties, Montreal and Mackenzie, and 79% of it comes from the top 4. There's about 15 counties altogether. Next slide. And again, type well curves on a county-by-county basis. So you can see how much better the top 2 counties are than even the average, and the bottom 11 counties are, questionable economics at present prices. Next slide. So I did the same thing with the Bakken, projecting future production, and again, it depends on how fast you drill the wells. If you keep drilling at current rates, or maybe increase rates a little bit to 2,500 wells per year, you get the middle curve, the purple curve. Personally, I think the Bakken is going to peak likely in the 2015-2016 timeframe at a little under 1.2 million barrels per day. So it's still going to go up for a while, but that is limited. I estimate they'll roughly quadruple the number of wells in the Bakken. So when it's close to being finished, we're looking at about 32,000 wells. Next slide. The Eagle Ford has now exceeded the Bakken. This is the distribution of wells, again colored by IP, initial productivity. And you can see the concentration of really good wells, the red wells, in the central part of the play. Next slide. Production out of the Eagle Ford, it's now close to 1.3 million barrels per day of oil and close to 5 BCF a day of gas. So the Eagle Ford is really one of the top 5 shale gas plays, as well as being the top tight oil play. There's a lot of very productive gas wells in the Eagle Ford. Next slide. They're drilling something like 3,500 wells per year in the Eagle Ford, so there's 10 wells being completed per day. That's an absolute drilling frenzy. It depends on how fast they keep drilling. If they were to increase the drilling rate to 4,000 wells per year from 3,500 it is today, would peak in 2018 at close to 2 million barrels per day. My most likely case is the red curve. I think it will peak in about 2017 at about 1.6 million barrels per day. They'll drill over 40,000 wells in Eagle Ford by the time it's finished. There's about 10,000 wells at present. Next slide. And this is what total gas, oil, and condensate production looks like out of the Eagle Ford in my most likely case. About 20% of the liquids that come out of the Eagle Ford are condensate. The overall production of all of it will occur probably about 2017. Next slide. So if we add in my most likely case for the Bakken and Eagle Ford and compare it to the EIA tight oil production, we need about 30 billion barrels of other tight oil to be produced by 2040 in order to meet the EIA forecast. So my projection would be roughly 14 billion barrels will come out of the Eagle Ford and the Bakken by 2040. There's been less than 2 billion barrels retrieved so far, so there's still a lot of oil yet to come. Next slide. There's been a lot of talk about the finances of shale players. Quite a few articles. This is one that was in Bloomberg. Shale drillers feast on junk debt to stay on the drilling treadmill. You have to keep pouring capital into these plays to drill the wells to keep production up. Next slide. This is a table produced by Deborah Rogers of what amounts to the capex in green and the negative cash flow in red from, I think there's 25 different shale producers here. So most of them are in the red. They're in negative cash flow territory. Next slide. That's not sustainable in the long term. This is a roll-up of negative cash flow by year. It's got a little better in 2013 compared to what it was in the past, but there's a lot of red ink in some of these shale gas companies and tight oil companies for that matter. Next slide. So the key takeaways on shale would be high field decline rates mandate sustained high levels of drilling to maintain production. Shale gas production from 7 plays constituting 88% of production is likely to peak in the 2015 to 2018 timeframe, depending on drilling rates. Tight oil production from the top 2 plays, constituting 62% of production, is likely to peak in the 2016 to 2017 timeframe. Increasing drilling rates significantly over current rates will increase immediate supply and raise peak production levels, and in fact move peak forward slightly. But what you're really doing is getting the oil sooner, not really increasing the ultimate recovery that much. High-quality shale plays are not ubiquitous. They're a relatively small proportion of the total number of shale plays that are out there. Next slide. So just to wrap up, there's no question that unconventional fuels will be important, but they're not scalable long-term to offset declining conventional supply, in my view. There's no doubt that the shale revolution has been a game changer. It's temporarily reversed the decline in supplies in the U.S. and in terms of conventional gas and oil in Canada. Almost all eggs are in the shale basket going forward in terms of meeting U.S. energy growth projections. Same thing in Canada. Most of it is looking at tar sands and shales in terms of future production growth. U.S. energy independence with the forecast energy trajectory is highly unlikely, barring a radical reduction in consumption. So in my mind, that's the only way the U.S. can become energy independent. Unconventional fuels have provided a temporary respite from declining oil and gas production, but should not be viewed as a panacea for increasing energy consumption and exporting the bounty. Rather, they should be used as an opportunity to create infrastructure needed for a lower energy throughput to maximize long-term energy security. In the long term, using less energy is probably the best guarantee of future energy sustainability and security. So I'll leave it there. Thank you. Yes, I'm here.
Yeah, we will take a few questions from the audience, if you don't mind.
Oh, no problem.
¿Cómo lo hacemos? Antonio?
Okay, so my question, just to sum up. You have talked about the technical questions, but of course the financial questions are also important. So my question is, taking into account that these companies, the companies exploiting the shales, are running into huge deficits, that they are financing through loans and so on, how do you expect this to impact future production?
I think that it could have a very serious impact. You can't keep doing that forever, right?
Yeah.
All of my projections are based on, assuming the capital will be there to drill the wells. But I think what we're looking at in the U.S. is that prices are going to have to go up.
Yeah.
Some of those wells in the sweet spots are definitely economic for companies that have land there. But as soon as the sweet spots are filled up, you have to go into lower quality rock. So you need prices in order to justify that. So they've been able to keep drilling by mergers and acquisitions, by acquiring leases early and selling them. But that can only go on for so long. And so it could have a very serious impact.
Okay, thanks a lot.
Good morning. This is Pedro Prieto from ASPO, Spain. I would like to ask you if you have explored the legal situation of the shale plays in the United States. The big difference with respect to Europe is that I understand that the underground is property of the owner of the above ground, which is quite different than here in Europe. Which are, if you know it, which are the legal requirements? Now, you have a country with hundreds of thousands of wells already drilled, and a rate of abandonment. I mean, they are abandoning the wells in question of months, of 50, 60, 70 months, and they are abandoning them by thousands. So which are the legal requirements requested to the drilling companies and the operating companies with respect to keep them isolated from the environment for the next 10, 20, 50 years and so on? Or which are the requirements to keep the ponds, the water ponds with the remaining liquids and toxics and chemicals out of the environment? Which are the rules in the United States? How do they work in this sense?
I think every state is different, but they do have quite rigorous, plugging and abandonment regulations in order to abandon those wells. How well that works is very debatable. There's been a lot of work that's been done out of Cornell recently, looking at, failed well casings and failed cement jobs, even on currently active wells, let alone wells that have been plugged and abandoned. And some of those older wells, people don't even know where they are, right? So, how well that's going to work over decades, I would, have a couple of questions about that. You could talk to people like Tony Ingraffia at Cornell, is an engineer. He's done a lot of work on, failed cement jobs and leaking methane and, contamination of groundwater and all those different things.
Are they required warranties, bonds, or collaterals to those companies to preserve the environment for the next decades?
I'm no expert on it, but I don't think there would be, enough of a bond that you could hold those people to look after those wells for many decades going forward. But I'm no expert on that.
Okay.
Hi, my name is Arnold. I am geologist too. I would like to ask if there are any problems about earthquakes, because I read in the news that near Oklahoma they have an incremental rate of small earthquakes that could be related with this kind of drilling. And thank you.
Yes, if a lot of the earthquakes are associated with water injection, water disposal. Mm-hmm. So a lot of that frack water is re-injected into different formations. And if you look at a seismically active area like Arkansas and Oklahoma, the number of small earthquakes has just gone up exponentially. Mm-hmm. So there's a very clear correlation between injection disposal of frac fluids. In terms of the act of fracking itself, that is less clear. Although certainly there was a good study done in northeastern British Columbia looking at seismicity caused by the actual fracking itself. And, these are very small earthquakes, but they are definitely there, and they're definitely related to the act of fracking. But for the most part, it's water disposal that has been the big issue with earthquakes.
Okay, thank you.
David, one final question. Another member of the audience wants to know if you have some data from potential shale wells in Spain.
Do I have any data for Spain?
Yeah.
No, I don't. There's a study that was done by ARI for the EIA that's on the net. That basically it was a world study of shale. And I think that they certainly have something for Spain. So that would be a sort of a very high-level overview report that you could have a look at. That's one of the problems with Europe. As was said, the U.S. has a tremendous legacy of drilling. There's been millions of wells drilled in the U.S. A lot of that data is in very good digital databases. So the knowledge level of the subsurface is very high in general in the U.S. by comparison to Europe. So, there's a lot of other issues with ownership and the, surface infrastructure in Europe that are going to make it a lot more difficult than in the U.S. But the knowledge of the details of the geology is another factor as well.
Yeah, we will talk about that in the afternoon, the situation in Spain and Europe. So thank you very much.